All righty, everybody. Hello, hello. Good morning. We are going to go ahead and record this to make sure that everybody has access. We are live on Facebook. My name is Eddie Chavez Calderon here with Uri Tzedek in partnership with our great friends from Arizona Jews for Justice and Valley Midrash. We are proud to bring another great content in our amazing series of speakers who we're just so excited to have and start with some powerhouses this upcoming year. So we are excited here. My great friend and mentor, Rabbi Shmuley, is going to start off with our intro of our speaker today, who is just amazing. And I'm glad to be able to talk not only about Judaism, but about some hip hop. So Rabbi Shmuley, go ahead and introduce our awesome speaker today.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you, Eddie, and for all your great work. And thank you all who are joining us here today for such an important topic, which is so interconnected with so many others. When we think about how we respond to white supremacy, when we think about how we respond to issues of force and of power and the interconnectivity of poverty and of race and of enforcement, when we think of systems of mass incarceration, both who is going into prison, how are they treated there, what does the reentry process look like, and what is our policing, what is our policing reveal about the political undercurrent, about the cultural undercurrent, about society today, and what does Torah have to say about that? And there's a lot of Torah, and it's really hard to do that in just an hour, but it's crucial we continue to do this because issues come in and out of the news and in and out of attention. But we can't allow that as Jews who are engaged with Torah. We can't allow pressing moral issues that are affecting lives on a daily basis to leave our consciousness. As a social justice movement, we believe we have to keep the momentum up in empathy, in awareness of the reality, and in the Torah that can guide our work. And really, the very first name that comes to mind in the American Jewish community for someone who continues to keep this up, keeps this alive in our consciousness is Aryeh. So Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein, a fifth generation Chicago South Sider with extensive experience in Torah education and organizing progressive Jewish communities. He works as national Jewish educator for Avodah, educational consultant for the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, and staff educator for the Jewish Initiative for Animals. Arya has previously taught and directed programs at Hadar, Drisha, and campuses, communities, and organizations around Israel and the US. He was an editor-translator for the Koren English edition of the Steinsaltz Talmud and is a senior editor of Jewschool.com. Arya studied for 7 years at Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa and also at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Yeshiva University, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and has rabbinic ordination for Rabbi Daniel Landy's Yashrut Institute. Rabbi Arya, thank you for joining us and for sharing Torah with us. And I know he's planning to present some sources and also to open up some Q&A and engagement. The floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Shmuley, and to Eddie. It's great to be here. I've had a long standing relationship with Uri Tzedek, going back to its early days when Rabbi Shmuley and Rabbi Aryeh Hart and other good folks were rabbinical students or just starting their studies and concerned about what Torah really wants us to be concerned about. And I've been a friend and fellow traveler of Uri Tzedek ever since then. So it's really great to be here and to see some many new friends and some long-term friends popping in as well. Good to see you here. Let's lower the expectations beyond the unreasonable heights that Rabbi Shmuley put them. But I'm certainly glad to be affiliated with movements and organizations such as Avodah and JCUA and JIFA that are communities with comrades and colleagues who are in the trenches for the long-term work. And I continually learn from those around me, including many of you who are on this call. So we're going to talk about police today, and I just want to frame things, say off the bat, I'm starting with an assumption. We're going to have a working assumption in our learning that while we will be paying attention to the Torah texts on their own terms, as we always have to do, letting the text speak for themselves and letting us actually be affected and influenced by them. We also are very aware of why we're especially looking for texts on the topics of police. I just want to name, I will be operating from the assumption that in the United States and really globally, there's a serious and systemic problem in policing, problems of racism, problems of brutality, of classism, etc. I want us to be very open to what solutions are. Movements, there are movements for police reform and police accountability. There are movements for police abolition. There's movements for defunding, which might lead to full abolition or be a middle ground. I want us to be open to all that, but I just want to acknowledge from the start that our starting point here is that there is a problem, that in principle, police are there to protect the community. And there are, to put it conservatively, there are many subsets of the human community in this country and globally who feel and statistically are not protected by, but endangered by the police. And we are looking to see to what extent and whether Torah can give us some language, some insights as to how to wade through these waters, who and what actually keeps us safe. So that's the framing here. I also want to acknowledge that there are some topics of contemporary relevance in the social justice sphere that lend themselves quite readily to Torah sources. When we think about situation of immigrants, undocumented people in the United States, that's actually a much closer main topic of Torah and continuing Torah literature, but especially the Torah itself really talks about that topic a lot, speaking to a community who's about to be landed with the assumption that there are going to be people living in the country who don't have the privileges of citizenship, who are vulnerable. Similarly, an article, I've done a lot of work on, I wrote an article of the Torah case for reparations. I would argue that reparations is actually a basic central Torah story of the parshiot that we're reading right now. And they're not doing a lot of stretching in order to tell that story. Police, I just want to acknowledge, is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more risk of anachronism when we try to mine Torah sources for guidance, thinking about police in the United States or globally today. Policing as we know it is a relatively recent phenomenon, though law enforcement, a muscle for enforcing judicial rulings, is not new, but the forms are very different. Race as we know it in America is both a fiction and a very particular and contemporary and modern fiction. So the main issues at play are issues that are not part of the historical context of the Torah or of the entire range of rabbinic sources. So that just means that we should be cautious and try to read conservatively and with humility, but also with a sense and with the emunah that our Torah has wisdom for us on everything. The wisdom might be more direct in some areas and more oblique in other areas. This might be one of the more oblique areas, but that there's still wisdom to be learned and that we can contribute to our human community. The American human community needs our unique particular contribution through lenses of Torah. Those are my assumptions coming in. And with that, let's just jump into the text. So I'm gonna share the screen. I believe Eddie has pasted a link to the source sheet in the chat. So if you prefer to access it on a different screen or separately, you can do that as well. I'm gonna walk through some sources. If you have questions as we go, you can pop them into the chat. After about a half hour of walking through some sources, we'll open up for more conversation, Q&A. If somebody has a clarification question, something wasn't clear, just pop that into the chat. And Eddie, do people have the ability to unmute themselves? I don't think so.
They do, yeah, they do.
They do. So if you have a clarification question, then you can go ahead and unmute yourself and interrupt and ask. If it's a more analytic question, we'll have time for that. You can put it in the chat so that everybody is thinking about your questions as we go. And with no further ado, let's jump into why we're actually here. And special hello to some of my chavrutot from life who have popped onto the screen. It's great to see you. Okay, so does everybody see the sources that the shared screen? Great. So I want to start by thinking about police accountability. People who are more audiovisual learners, if you go on YouTube or on My Jewish Learning portal, I gave an Eli talk a few years ago about Torah police accountability, walking through some of these sources too. So I want to walk through some core sources. We're going to start with Parshat Shoftim, Devarim chapter 16, which is, the Torah's, main little nugget about setting up a criminal justice system. I'll kind of be working in the Hebrew and the English. I know people have different language facilities. So judges and officers, you shall appoint for your tribes and all your gates, which Hashem your God gives you, and they shall judge the people with a just law. Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha b'chol she'arecha, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha l'shvatecha v'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. Verse 19, we get the specifics. And it's really, when you think about like all that goes into setting up a criminal justice system, it's sobering that we've got really just one verse for the specifics of this criminal justice system that we were commanded in verse 18 to set up. Don't pervert the law, don't show any partiality, don't take a bribe. And that's really the three mitzvot. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the just. Maybe one of the most famous verses in the Torah to emphasize the significance of this passage. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue, in order that you may live and inherit the land which Hashem your God is giving you. L'man tichyev yarashta et haaretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach. I want to notice a few things about this passage. One is that, moving from the back, is that this is the passage in the Torah that speaks most emphatically about the pursuit of justice. And while many progressive Jewish voices and organizations, including ones I'm connected to and probably me personally, will quote this verse, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, verse 20, justice, justice shall you pursue, for a whole broad array of the justice concerns that we work for. And that might be appropriate. But I just want to note that the context in which that heightened language appears in the Torah is the context of the criminal justice system. It's about the criminal justice system that the Torah uses its most pumped up language. And that the pumping up happens in two ways. One, the emphatic repetition of the noun, not just tzedek tirdof, but tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which is a biblical linguistic motif for emphasis, to repeat something. And secondly, it's not the verb that we see more commonly in the book of Devarim for the establishment of law, which would be ta'aseh, tzedek ta'aseh, justice you shall do. But pursue, the tirdof, gives it more oomph, that this is something that we're in constant, it's a constant process, a constant chase after justice. So, we've learned that the criminal justice system is very important by this heightened language. And two, the end of that verse, we see the stakes. L'ma'an tichyeh, v'yarashta et ha'aretz asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, in order that you may live and inherit the land which Hashem your God is giving you. The stakes are very high. If we get it wrong with the criminal justice system, or if we don't implement a criminal justice system or a criminal justice system that reflects tzedek tzedek tirdof, we're not allowed to live. And we have no right to manage a body politic manifested or demonstrated in the Torah via inheriting the land which Hashem your God is giving you. Inheriting land, being able to run a body politic, is dependent, according to this parsha, on managing a criminal justice system. So we really want to get it right. and really mine verses 18 and 19 to understand how we get it right. So a few things I want to note that I'm kind of collecting observations that I've heard from different people studying this passage when in the pre-Zoom days we've been able to have more open-ended conversations. One is that if shotrim, officers, were not listed in this parsha, everything would read perfectly smoothly. Judges you shall appoint for your tribes and all your gates, which Hashem gives you, they shall judge the people with a just law. The verb there is judge, which fits much more naturally with judges. So there's a way in which shotrim seem to be like stuck in a surprising way. But maybe what that helps us understand, first of all, is that there is a whole range of judgment, of judging, that happens outside of the boundaries of the judicial decisions issued by judges, or in our case here, juries as well. The judgment happens in all sorts of ways, and certainly those who have understood bias, racism, classism, etc., the unfair impacts of policing on indigenous people, Black people, trans people, and more in the United States today, and other oppressed populations elsewhere in the world, we can understand that a lot of that has to do with the judging that is made in, is this a situation to de-escalate or to escalate? Is this somebody who is in need of support, maybe for a health or financial concern, or is this somebody who needs to be restrained? All sorts of judgment that goes into that. And there's something striking that officers are part of the subject of judging the people with a just law. The second thing I just want us to notice in terms of our context in the United States, often, very strangely, people who are resisting police reform will say, it's a few bad apples, we need to get the right people in there, etc. First of all, that's strange just because like the adage, the farmer's adage, a few bad apples, is a few bad apples spoil the whole crop. It's about the system. And so people who think about a few bad apples should be the people leading the charge for reforms so as not to spoil the whole crop. Be that as it may, there's also, our verse 19 acknowledges that the issues are systemic and not just getting the right people in there. Even the right people can be perverted by an unjust system. Don't take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and twist the words of the just. It's worth thinking broadly. Are there ways in which in the judicial system, in the policing system, there are deep structural equivalences of bribes that have been instituted in the system? For example, when police contracts, which we'll talk about a little more in depth in a minute, when police contracts, for example, the Chicago police contract stipulates that it's forbidden for a whistleblower to be rewarded for whistleblowing. Now, the contract's not able to say that whistleblowers can be punished, because that would be illegal, unconstitutional, but the contract says that they can't be rewarded. What kind of incentive system does that set up for police officers when they see maybe a colleague engaging in misconduct and they're bothered by it? Where does that direct other police officers? And are there ways in which that is actually the public in a certain way bribing the officers in a certain direction? So those are questions I want to leave. And I want to turn to a rabbinic text, processing the stakes of how we get it right, how we get it wrong. I'm just going to check the chat for a moment. I'm going to stop the share just for a moment to check the chat, see if there are questions we should address as we go.
I think there's just comments right now.
Great. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to go back and continue with a rabbinic source. So there's a brief, somewhat cryptic midrash in Dvarim Rabbah a somewhat late rabbinic collection, working through the book of Devarim, understanding what officers, shotrim, are doing here. I want to just acknowledge again, in terms of fearing anachronism, that there's some dispute among, well, I would say dispute's a little strong. There's some ambiguity recognized by scholars as to who exactly what the role was of these shotrim mentioned in the Torah. It might be closer to like less on the detainment and more on the like instituting punishment side, like people instituting lashes probably. But be that as it may, they are the state's muscle, the people given tools of violence and authorized to use violence by the state in protection of the law. So the rabbis want to understand their role in this judging process. What do we learn from the fact that shotrim are part of this subject of judging the people with the just law? So the Midrash in Dvarim Rabbah says, the rabbis say, Rabbanin Amrei, police officers should be like judges, sheyehei shoter kashofet, in that they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip. Sheyu hama'asim keneged hamakal, so that the one issuing lashes should not be required to receive lashes. V'shelo yeh hamalkeh tzarich lilkot. Let's unpack this a little bit. What would be the context in which somebody issuing lashes would be required to receive lashes? So the standard punishment in rabbinic law and halacha for a violation of a standard prohibition in the Torah, issuing a predatory loan to somebody, eating pork, etc. A standard prohibition, the punishment is lashes. The Mishnah sets the maximum for that as 39 lashes and gives some other regulations that the person issuing lashes, the shoter, can't exceed what the convicted criminal can handle, etc. So there's some judgment going into the administration of lashes, not too hard, but not underestimating it, etc. So since the administering of these lashes is itself a fulfillment of the law, and that there are laws and regulations guiding that, if a shoter violates the law in how they administer lashes, that itself would be a crime, just like eating pork is a crime, and they themselves would be liable to getting lashes from somebody else. And because that's the case, because criminality, law violation, is always latent within the violence, even when it's authorized violence, that agents of state violence are meting out, because of that, they should carry out their deeds facing the rod and the whip. And the way I understand that, I think that means, is that systems need to be set up to make sure that when the shoter is issuing state-sanctioned violence, they are made to be constantly aware of the violence that they're meting out and the violence threatened to them in a mirror image if they do it improperly. And I think from the Midrash's perspective, it's a little more understood that there are systems in place for judges. There's more management, there's more observation happening of courtrooms. The judges are more aware of the consequences. And maybe some of the judging that happens by shotrim happens a little bit off camera. And the Midrash is noting that the presence here in this Parshat Shoftim teaches us that shotrim, like shoftim, like judges, need to be, when they have to mete out state-sanctioned violence, do it in such a way that they're in constant fear and recognition of the violence that is due to them if they do it improperly. And needless to say, this is not an abolitionist text. These texts are assuming state-sanctioned violence as part of the ecosystem, as part of the landscape, and are working through using the threat of more violence to contain violence that's being meted out. So I want to acknowledge that for people who are in more abolitionist frameworks, these texts are going to be challenging texts. But I do want to acknowledge that even within this framework, the framework that assumes policing, that assumes state-sanctioned violence and the cycle of violence as legitimate and authentic, the framework is grounded in a radical sense of police accountability. I want to make a contrast. Several years ago, Chicago's then mayor, Rahm Emanuel, was being asked by many reporters and critics why violent crime, gun crime in particular in Chicago, was on the rise. And his response, this is like 2015-16, his response was that as a result of the heightened scrutiny of police officers across the country in response to the murder of Mike Brown and the Baltimore uprising after the murder of Freddie Gray, et cetera, that because of the culture of heightened scrutiny of police have, in Rahm Emanuel's language, gone fetal. And they're not being willing to do their jobs. And he's basically saying to people who are being in communities ravaged by violence, what you need is more policing. And so you need to leave the police alone so that they can do the policing and save you, even though those same communities say they're even more threatened by police. And he was, really the philosophy underlying what Mayor Emanuel was saying, and what has really become a common trope among policing advocates around the country, is that in order to do their job properly, police have to be free from the scrutiny that interrupts their ability to do their work. And I think that Chazal are understanding the Torah to be saying literally the opposite of that. This is Rahm Emanuel's Torah also, to say literally the opposite of that. Police, in order to do their job properly, in order to have a fighting chance of doing their job properly, they have to operate under the most heightened scrutiny, under the heightened fear of violence being meted onto them. That they're certain to do a bad job and therefore curse the entire community to not be allowed to live and inherit the land which Hashem our God is giving us, if they're not under heightened scrutiny facing the rod and the whip. And by what this means, I think, translated into practice, is significant contract reform, civilian oversight, significant work to undermine cultural impacts of the thin blue line or whatever within police departments. But a lot of it is actually legal. I want to mention to you just a couple of features of the Chicago police contract, which is a little extreme but not uncharacteristic of other departments around the country. So one feature of the Chicago police contract that was lambasted in a scathing report by the Department of Justice in late 2016 is that if somebody observes police misconduct and wants to issue a report for it to be investigated, they have to sign a legal affidavit, which means that the officer who against whom there's an investigation will already know the name and address of the person who snitched. Now, there's a lot to be said for standing before your accuser when you're actually in a court of law, but we're just talking about departmental investigations. Somebody saw something, maybe it turns out it was nothing. How many acts of police misconduct are going to go unreported because the person who was victimized or who saw it is worried about violence that they would experience if the police officer knows who they are, where they live? Another example. You or I as civilians, if we are engaged in an act of violence or criminality and we're detained, we have to, of course, give a statement right away. It's in the Chicago police contract that they, if a police officer is involved in a shooting or other potential misconduct action, they have 24 hours before they have to issue their statement. If we ever wonder how it is that, like when Laquan McDonald was murdered, not only did Jason Van Dyke lie, but all other 8 officers who were standing there told the same lie. How were they able to do that? Because Jason Van Dyke had 24 hours before he had to give his statement. The contract protected that right, which we don't have as civilians. They were able to get their story straight. Another feature of the Chicago police contract is that if officer makes a statement and subsequent to that, evidence surfaces contradicting the statement. Let's say video footage showing that Laquan McDonald wasn't charging, but was actually moving away. The officer is legally protected and allowed to change their statement on the record. They have a get out of jail free card. Of course, civilians don't have that right. What we see, and what the Department of Justice issued a very brutal critique of the Chicago Police Department and its contract, saying that it's not just a cultural thing. There are 14 elements of the contract that are in place in order to undermine accountability, to prevent accountability in Lishna D'Rabbanan, to make it so that police officers don't have to face the rod and the whip, so they can do their policing free of oversight and scrutiny and with the ability to operate freely. And I think our Torah is saying quite the opposite. If you're going to have policing, which these texts seem to assume, you have to have it with a robust structure of accountability in place. Officers, to speak mythically, have to always carry out their policing deeds, their ma'asim, facing the rod and the whip, always afraid of scrutiny and of punishment if they get it wrong. That is what enables them to act with the sobriety, with the prudence, and with the restraints that are going to be necessary to do their job properly. I'm going to pause for a second there and see if there are any questions or observations. Great. My old roommate, Chavruta, and comrade, Rabbi Aaron Levy asks, is the Chicago Police Department contract reflective of common practice in the US or is it an outlier? It's a great question, Aaron. I think it's somewhere in between those. The Chicago Police Department, among others, I think Baltimore, St. Louis, have been seen as exceptionally problematic departments. You know, the Department of Justice hasn't issued these scathing reports against every police department in the country. So it's somewhat extreme, but I think an outlier would be too strong. I think what you're seeing there are things that are consistent with policing around the country. Some municipalities have, I guess, had less political resistance to reform movements, and so more tinkering has happened. I think Dallas, Los Angeles have had some response. Los Angeles, part of it was just because, you know, the aftermath of the uprising after the Rodney King beatings and acquittal and all that. There was the exposure, and some of that is, God willing, you know, in process in Chicago right now as well. So yeah, so I would say that, like, there are some cities like Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, and I'm sure many others, Milwaukee, I think, that are Minneapolis, that I think are especially draconian and structured around lack of accountability, and probably have the most kind of like white nationalist influence on the departments also. But you're talking about a matter of degree. Nobody in the country, nowhere in the country, to my knowledge, is a municipal police department, and I don't know about Canada, where I know you are. Nowhere in the United States is there a police department that is subject to real, actual civilian control of, you know, beyond contract reform, of a real civilian. There are civilian advisory boards in Seattle and Los Angeles that have had some positive impact, but real civilian control, where there's an elected civilian body that can fire officers, fire the chief of police, that has that real control. That doesn't exist anywhere in the country. It might exist in Chicago by the end of this month. There's been a brutal fight that the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs has been part of, and we'll see what happens there. But Chicago is both worse than average, but part of the spectrum. Bob and Linda say, how about the word "are" rather than afraid of accountability? aware calls into be. I'm not sure I understand the question, so I'm going to move forward. Why don't you, I think there's a typo in there. I'm not sure what it is, so you can rewrite it and I'll.
There's a typo in there. You use the word afraid continuously, but
Yeah.
if you use the word aware, it
Yeah.
calls the person in for better thing. I'm aware as a physician that I
Yeah.
have to do things and I have to do the correct thing.
Yeah.
One thing on the fact that they can change things. As a physician, whenever I make a mistake, an error, I can amend my note, but I am absolutely forbidden to cross out or change the note that I made. And I've had that happen to me where I made an error and then made the correction.
I'm really glad that you raised that, Bob. And I think the questions of fear and awareness are, I think this rabbinic text has room for both in that range. I think I was gravitating toward fear because these are texts that are dwelling so deeply in the world of violence and not imagining beyond them. And I wanted to acknowledge that that's part of it. I think it's good to speak of awareness, and I think that that's actually a more conservative word to use here, which is appropriate. And to say that, yeah, in order to do policing properly, you have to be constantly aware of the violence that you will face if you get this wrong, if you act improperly. And I'm really glad you brought up the medicine example, because there's another area where practitioners have people's safety, health, life, and death in their hands. You know, everything that police officers say about, like, you don't understand the stress, how difficult this work is. Well, some people do. You know, surgeons do. Emergency room doctors do. A lot of people actually do. Childbirth doctors, a lot of physicians and nurses understand that stress. And in the medical profession, doctors and nurses, I think, are certainly aware of not only the consequence on their patients, but thank you, Aviva, social workers, mental health field, yeah, many other people. But also, I think there is also an area of fear, which works both positively and negatively. The fear of lawsuits, the fear of being of not having your license renewed, etc. Those are real fears because there's systems of oversight in place. Are they perfect? Certainly not. And there's a lot of questions to be had about the litigious, nature of our the healthcare system in the United States. But certainly the fact that people who hold people's life in their hands have to be operating under scrutiny and oversight, and the recognition that if they get it wrong, they could face real penalties akin to the violence that they're meeting out. So thanks for bringing that in. Yeah, Elliot points out something interesting, that a generous translation of when I said fear, rendering that as yirah, which is kind of like the fear that is like reverence, as opposed to mere pachad, of fear of punishment. Though I think that's part of the issue too. With your permission, I want to share screen again, and I want to pivot the conversation into potentially a more radical direction and start thinking about what guidance does Torah have, any guidance or insight, light to shine on questions of defund. Do we need policing of this scope in the first place? Is that making us safe? Do we need policing at all in the first place? And I want to share a text that is, I think, almost unknown in progressive Jewish communities, is a little better known in parts of the Orthodox world, but somewhat disregarded because of who I think has taken ownership over this text. And I think that Jews involved in social justice work have insights in this text that are going to be useful to the project of understanding Torah as best we can. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'll just point out, just to close the previous thing, the Netziv, reading that, points out that titein lecha, the singular language of, as opposed to titnu lechem, but the singular language means that this is a civic responsibility of the entire community, and there should be civilian oversight, that it's the community who function as a Sanhedrin have oversight over the police. So forgot to go into that, but yeah, the Netziv is an interesting direct source for civilian oversight boards. Okay, so I want to look at this text in the Talmud Yerushalmi. It appears in many other midrashic collections as well. I think the Psiktas Rav Kahana and elsewhere. Here's the Yerushalmi's version in Masechet Chagiga. A piquant story that should be recognizable to us both in civic language and in Jewish language. I'll read this in English. If you have facility in Aramaic, I invite you to follow along in the Aramaic. Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi sent Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami to travel the cities of the land of Israel so as to appoint teachers of Torah and Mishnah for them. They arrived in one place and couldn't find any teachers of Torah and Mishnah. Alin lachad atar v'lo eshkachon la safar v'la matnayan. So let's just stop there for a second and recognize. So the problem is, even though they're in Eretz Yisrael, and we can mythically think of, the time of Mishnah and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, all these guys, and then the early Amoraic period that they're operating in here, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, Rabbi Ami, Rabbi Yochanan, all these greats, there must have just been Torah everywhere. It's like, no, we've just read the material bequeathed to us by those who were engaged in Torah, but there were places that were like really not engaged in Torah. In Eretz Yisrael, couldn't find any teachers of Torah and Mishnah. Also, being in Chicago, I think about how early in his first term, Rahm Emanuel closed 50 elementary schools, almost entirely in grossly under-resourced neighborhoods, most of them Black and brown, which left elementary school children who may not have had an adult available to drive them or take them to school, having to walk long distances to get to school, often crossing different neighborhoods, gang territories, and so on, and being in places of danger. So what does it mean just in real terms to reflect on places that are bereft of teachers of Torah and Mishnah? So anyway, Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami, they say to them, the city's residents, bring us the city's protectors and the city's guards. The residents say back to them, here are our city's protectors. Now, it doesn't tell us whom they bring forward. I think the text is expecting us to use our imagination, that they bring forward like the cops, the city guards, etc. Those they have aplenty. So the rabbis responded, these are nothing but the city's destroyers. Charuve karta. The residents say to them, well, all right, if the cops aren't the city's protectors and guards, then who are you? What are you, wise guys? What do you mean? Who are you looking for? So they respond, teachers of Torah and Mishnah. This is the meaning of that which is written, Im Adonai lo yishmor ir, shav shakad shomer. Unless God watches over the city, the watchman keeps watch in vain. If you go back into the middle, the term in this Gemara for city's protectors and city's guards, back when the rabbis say, bring us the city's protectors and city's guards, that's neture karta and santure karta. Neture karta, city's guards. So that, of course, is the name of the radical Hasidic sect that is most discussed in modern, especially progressive Jewish circles for its famous anti-Zionism. And some progressive non-Zionists or anti-Zionists or liberal Zionists have kind of affection for them as like a group of Jews who look authentic, problematic, assumptions, but very present in the Jewish community, who are not on board with, rampant nationalism and so on. And I think they're actually, the imagined allegiance is actually a false one, because most of those progressive Jews who are questioning either Zionism generally or the way Zionism gets played out as ultranationalism, those people are usually hyper interested in politics and the importance religiously, Jewishly, of being invested in the body politic and real life of the community. I think the Neturei Karta are understanding a message from this text, which is, I think, a possible message from this text. The message should be that we should not be involving ourselves in any of that this worldly muscle, that doesn't keep us safe. What keeps us safe is learning Torah. That's what we should entirely be doing, learning Torah. If God doesn't watch over the city, the watchman keeps watch in vain. It's stupid. All that stuff is stupid. Forget it. We should be learning Torah. I think there's another reading of this Gemara, which I think is a better reading, but it's at least, I think, as possible a reading, which is that they're saying this, they're making this rhetorical case in a place that has been grossly defunded of its educational and cultural institutions. It's hard to find teachers of Torah and Mishnah there, but it's readily available. Everybody knows who the cops are. You can find them right away. And that their priorities are out of whack. And this text is not necessarily saying that there isn't necessarily any place for muscle. And it's certainly not saying that there's no relevance, that there's no importance of being involved in this worldly concerns. But it's that ultimately what really keeps us safe is our cultural and educational relationships, our spiritual relationships. Sometimes when I teach with a, in a longer time framework, when I teach this text, I open up by having participants share, either in the chat or out loud, what keeps you safe. And remarkably, very few people will say, like the cops or the alarm system in my house keep me safe. Sometimes people will add that, but most of what people share as to what really keeps them safe is trusting relationships, resources, things like that there are lights in the neighborhood that I live, or that the roof is secure in my house, that I know people around me, that I have places to go when I'm in trouble, that I have relationships. And something that I think, can push people to expand their minds in the direction, in a defund or abolitionist kind of direction, is thinking about, if, let's say, somebody a friend's teenage kid was bullying your kid, or was damaging your property, or was threatening you, would your instinct be to call the cops on your friend's teenage kid? I think most people would find non-policing interventions, except in the most extreme situations, trying to talk to the parents, try to find counseling, try to find other ways to work out the system. We know the best ways of keeping ourselves safe. Where policing is brought in is specifically where there's anonymity, where relationships have been broken down, where people's sense of solidarity has been broken down, where the systems and networks and ecosystems of learning, of relationship, of culture, teachers of Torah and Mishnah, thinking broadly applied to the civic landscape, have been broken down. That's where people then default to muscle, and to using muscle against people that I don't have a connection with either. And when that happens, the watchman watches in vain. Shav shakad, what's the word? Shav shakad hashomer. Ultimately, there may be times when we have deep relationship and conflict, heightens tensions, and we may need somebody stronger than the two of us to break us up. I'm going to stay open to that. But it's got to be way smaller. And what I think this Yerushalmi wants us to think of is that when we think about who serves and protects us, the first things we go to are the very well-funded, well-endowed, well-populated public services of culture, education, opportunity, job training, relationships, sociability, camaraderie, things that make communities places where people watch out for each other. Does that effort of defunding police, which really means refunding all of the things that really make us safe, will that lead us eventually to zero shomrim or shotrim? I don't know. But I think this Talmud Yerushalmi guides us in a strong defund direction to make sure that our priorities are on the things that make us all long-term safer, which are the things of culture, spirituality, relationship, education. So I'm going to pause there and open for questions and discussion. People can either, whatever your preference, post questions or observations in the chat, or unmute yourself and speak up, or raise your hand either physically or virtually, and we can have a conversation.
All good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, folks, you can unmute yourself or send us a message on your chat right here. I'm gonna actually take the privilege of being the host and ask the first question, Rabbi Aryeh, if possible. What do you say to Jewish facilities and institutions, etc., who have a very good relationship with police because police protects them? So when they want to realistically advocate for a just policing system, they're kind of in between that line where it's like, well, we want to maintain our relationship with the police, but we also acknowledge the awfulness that happens. So what do you say to those folks?
So what I say is actually something that comes up a lot. It's not theoretical for me. What I actually say, first of all, I think that there are a lot of different ways to have a good relationship. I think a dependent relationship is not a good relationship. So yeah, I think that civic organizations should try to have good relationships with civic authorities, meaning like, yeah, if I'm operating a shul or a JCC or something, I'm going to want to know who the police department have relationships and be cordial. But it's not, that's very different than hiring people to be guards and protectors on whom we're then dependent. Let me share an anecdote that I think will flesh out why it's so problematic in terms of, is it a good relationship when Jewish institutions hire police to protect them, whether they're off duty or in uniform. A few years ago, the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs, which is like the Arizona Jews for Justice of Chicago, but 50 years older, was beginning its our campaign, joining a campaign on police accountability. And I was having a community meeting. We wanted to be a big community meeting, like 200-300 people, with some speakers just educating on the issues of police accountability, movements for civilian oversight and contract reform, and just learning about the issues, a learning meeting. One of JCUA's congregational partners volunteered to host it. They thought, for whatever reasons, like from their programming interests, this program fit the shul's programming interests. And then like a week or two before the program, they had to cancel hosting it because they, like almost all congregations in Chicago and around the country, have off-duty police officers as their security team. When the security team saw the program calendar for the month, they got together with each other and agreed that none of them would sign up for that shift. So the congregation said, we can't host it because nobody was willing to do security for it, so we don't host it. JCUA were like, okay, we don't care. Like, we don't need security for it. We just need like a sanctuary, a big space where we can have 300 people and a mic. But from the congregation's perspective, at this point, once they've set up a security apparatus and they can't operate it, then it's an insurance problem. And they have liability. It didn't matter what JCUA thought. And so just understand what that means. Whether you think you care about this program or not, you have a situation here where outside police officers are making programming decisions for a congregation against the programming interests of the shul. Gentile police officers who are there are making programming decisions of what the shul thought was the right program for it to run. Maybe it wasn't the right program, but they couldn't even make that decision. Is that a good relationship with police? I don't know. It doesn't seem like it to me. That seems like actually a warped relationship with police that's around dependency. And it makes me wonder, you know, to the extent that this kind of muscle is necessary in our security, what's happening when Jewish communities automatically think, well, if we need that kind of muscle, we automatically go to the outside, to police. You know, after the horrible, you know, white supremacist mass murder at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, all these synagogues and federations monetizing, incentivizing for synagogues to go and bring in paid, police security. I didn't hear any mainstream congregations actually asking, what do congregations who have a learned distrust of police or don't have the financial resources to hire armed security, what are they doing? What do churches that are, Catholic churches that are mostly Mexican immigrants? Or what do Black churches? What do Muslim mosques? Those are all communities that are likely to have hesitation on relying on police for the security. What are they doing for security? They're as threatened or more by white supremacists as the Jewish community is. And it seems to me that would be a much more useful source of wisdom for our community. It requires having real relationships. Well, if those relationships aren't in place, then people are scrambling. I know that, there's a rabbinic tradition of acknowledging the ability even to learn from those who are hostile to us. The Nation of Islam has its own security apparatus. They certainly don't trust the cops. Now, they're no fans of us, and I'm no fan of the Nation of Islam, but the Nation of Islam trains its own people to provide its own security. It seems to me a member of the own mosque would do a better job at providing security if they have whatever the requisite of training is than some outside cop who doesn't know anybody. How are these cops even supposed to offer security? Do we have any reason to believe that Robert Bauer would have been prevented from entering the Tree of Life synagogue had there been a cop there? If there were like a metal detector that everybody had to go through, that would have stopped it. I agree, but most of these congregations haven't been willing to go that route. The actual bourgeois congregants don't want to be inconvenienced by having to go through metal detector being patted down. You just want a security who can tell. Why would Robert Bowers not have been let in? Especially, let's say if it's a Shabbos where there's like a bar bat mitzvah or something like that, or some other simcha. But even in general, newcomers come. Why wouldn't he have been let in? What it seems to me, what usually happens is that, the people who are of the actual profile that poses the most threat to Jews in America, which is white men who have been radicalized into white nationalism, would make it past screening, whereas totally irrelevantly, Black and brown people get all sorts of heightened scrutiny and pat down, even though we haven't seen threats to congregations on that kind of level from populations like that. And we have a lot of Jews who are Black and brown who then get inconvenienced and don't want to come to shul. So to me, it strikes me as very counterintuitive and not reflective of a good relationship, but of actually a warped bully relationship that's not constructive. And I just think we'll have much better solutions if we actually do the work of relationship building on the ground and actually thinking about what's happened in terms of internalized anti-Semitism around internalizing, Jewish self-conceptions of weakness, Jewish self-conceptions of masculinity that are grounded in anti-Semitism, even though like in the 1920s, every boxing champion in the United States, except for the heavyweight champion, was Jewish. Like the notion of, and there were Jewish gangs and everything, certainly Israel is a signature example of Jews being perfectly capable of brutal violence and muscle. So what's going on when a Jewish community assumes that to the extent that it needs protection, armed protection, which I don't assume, but even if that's the case, why would we look to police departments, which we know, and we've seen evidence over and over again, have been largely under prioritizing, sympathetic to, and in many cases infiltrated by the very people who threaten us. Just to make it very, very concrete here in Chicago, Chicago obviously is very blue, very democratic. If you look at the election results, both 2016 and 2020, which you can see the map, precinct by precinct, how many people in each precinct neighborhood voted for each candidate. The whole city is very, very blue. You know, the richest neighborhoods are a little lighter blue. There are basically 5 pockets of deep red. And those are the 4 neighborhoods that are majority police officers and their families, and West Rogers Park, which is the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. Those are deep red, and the rest of the city is deep blue. We see that the police are Team Trump. They, you know, in Chicago actively elected a Fraternal Order of Police Union president who critiqued his white supremacist predecessor for being insufficiently white nationalistic, insufficiently misogynist. They elected a guy who was on suspension at the time because of his long record of police misconduct, and that's who they elected. This is the majority. And you know, if there are cops who are not, there are cops who are good, but ultimately, if you're part of a structure and a system that has been friendly to, or at least not prioritizing white nationalism as a threat, and that is what threatens us, why would you go to that arm for protection? It makes no sense to me.
Right. Thank you so much. I think we have one more comment. I think Aviva wanted to speak. Aviva, do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. I was wondering. Thank you. I have a situation, and I wonder what both you, Arya, and everyone on this call would say to this. So regarding the security at a shul, without mentioning any names, after Pittsburgh, and I live in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is close to Pittsburgh, even before Pittsburgh, I'll back up. I've worked in gun violence prevention off and on for 20 years. I was shot and almost killed as a teenager by an assault rifle weapon. I have studied it. I've worked in Washington. I have a little bit of an idea about it. And I went to my synagogue leaders and said, you know, Philadelphia could be next. Here's what we need to do. We need to do X, Y, and Z. And I outlined it. And I said, and no further like discussion about making people nervous. And this is not just a question of whether we hire an armed guard. This is not just a question of whether we lock, you know, the doors or not. But the way that we've done this so far by issuing a survey to people and asking them if they feel comfortable with an armed guard and if they feel comfortable with locking the doors and if they want to pay attention to this or not, or if they just want to wear their long flowy skirts and not pay attention to it because it disrupts their Shabbos ideas. And the feedback and what proceeded was several months of leadership at first going, oh, sure, Aviva. And then saying, no, we are, oh, it's still live. Can you take it off again?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead
You
and
just
take
have to,
live off.
it was off. No, you have to stop Facebook Live. It's separate from recording.